one of the most notorious jails in American history, the scene of armed rebellions and brutal killings led by wicked mountain men. This is the true story of Brushy Mountain Prison. Brushy Mountain Prison. For over 100 years, this maximum security prison has been known as the Alcatraz of the South, and it was the end of the line for some of the most notorious outlaws in the annals of American crime. Coming up, we take you behind the walls for an exclusive look at some of the most ruthless outlaws to ever call this brutal place their home. Just south of the Kentucky border lies one of the most untamed places in Appalachia, Morgan County, Tennessee, a mountain wilderness spanning over 525 square miles. Even today, there are only 4 main 2-lane roads in the entire county, and for the past 250 years, it has remained one of the most sparsely populated areas in this part of America. And for those rugged individuals who call this place home, it was a land of make it do or do without, teeming with every conceivable wild animal. And these snake-infested mountains, only the hardiest of men survived here. They were fiercely independent, and each man was born with an inherent distrust of any form of government. Yet, after the Civil War, southern states were completely broke. Northern industrialists began purchasing huge tracts of land in Morgan County, and nearly overnight, they set up mining operations where they began scalping the mountains of the riches. That's right, coal was needed to power America's northern cities, and the wealthy businessmen and politicians saw their chance to cash in on the massive supply of black gold in these mountains. Just like that, railroads were cut through the virgin forest to the site of the mines, where coal towns sprang up. For the first time in history, paying jobs had come to Morgan County. Yet, after some time, the northern businessmen had had their fill of the rebellious ways of the mountaineer, who were always demanding better pay and working conditions. And they were also prone to walk out of the mines and strike just as coal demand was at its highest. Simply put, it was costing the coal barons some serious money. So they replaced the striking workers with inmates that they rented from Tennessee's prisons. This new system allowed the government to cash in as well. They simply forced the prisoners to work in the mines for free. And in return, the coal companies padded the pockets of the politicians. The result of this good old boy system was that the mountaineers no longer had jobs, while the prisoners had become de facto slaves. And by 1891, the mountaineers had finally had enough, and they launched into an all-out war against those coal companies. They burned down the camps, freed the prisoners, and seized coal mining operations. And in return, the state of Tennessee sent in the militia. And for the next 2 years, an all-out battle ensued between the two sides that would become known as the Coal Creek War, before the state of Tennessee finally agreed to end their practice of leasing prisoners to coal companies. But the mountaineers hadn't actually won. In reality, it was just more underhanded trickery from those politicians. And one of the shadiest moves, they simply cut the middleman out of the equation. And instead of leasing prisoners to the coal companies, the state decided to build a prison at the site of those mines themselves and continue to use free convict labor. Thus, Brushy Mountain Prison was born. So, from the very beginning, Brushy Mountain was the last place a man wanted to be. The guards were brutal to any one of them that got out of line. The prisoners were forced to work 15-hour days, 6 days a week with a pickaxe in the dark pits of the earth. In many ways, a sentence to Brushy Mountain was a death sentence. No safety precautions, terrible mining disasters, and diseases took the lives of countless men. And soon, Tennessee was making more money than it had ever dreamed of from coal. And Brushy Mountain, well, it developed a notorious reputation as the end of the line, where the most brutal criminals were sent. More and more, the population of Brushy grew, and the new arrivals were forced to mine rock from the surrounding mountains and build a new castle-like structure in the shape of a cross. This fortress was surrounded by massive rock walls and 8 towers that were constantly manned with shotgun-toting guards. This Alcatraz of the South was located in a sea of rugged terrain, and any man who escaped would have no chance of making it out of those mountains with bloodhounds on their trail. And for the next 118 years, Brushy Mountain was a maximum security hellhole that was home to some of the men with the blackest souls to ever walk the face of this earth. Coming up, we take an exclusive look at some of Brushy Mountain's most notorious residents and the shocking crimes that led them to Appalachia's most feared prison.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller Volume 1 and 2 or the brand new book Molly's Story today.
Perhaps the most infamous resident ever to call Brushy Mountain Prison home was none other than James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King Jr. James Earl Ray was born in Alton, Illinois during the Great Depression. And from an early age, Ray was exposed to petty criminal activity, and his family was frequently on the move from state to state due to his father's habit of stealing and writing bad checks. The restlessness of always being on the move would be a theme for Ray's life. After all, he dropped out of school by the age of 12, and as soon as he was old enough, he signed up for the Army at the close of World War II. However, Ray was never one for taking orders, and soon the Army sent him packing. And by the time he was 20, he began following in his father's footsteps of criminal activity. First, he was jailed for a string of burglaries in 1949, but released after a few months in jail. Still on the move, Ray soon found himself back in Illinois, where he put a .357 Magnum into a taxi driver's neck and robbed him. And for that, he earned himself another 2 years in prison. 3 years later, Ray was back out on the streets, where he was arrested in Missouri for stealing money orders, and just like that, 4 more years in Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas. By 1959, Ray was again released, where he robbed a Kroger cashier at gunpoint in St. Louis, and as a repeat offender, he was sentenced to 20 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. In prison, Ray seemed to be a model prisoner, and soon earned a coveted job of working as a baker in the kitchen. But things aren't always as they appear, and by 1967, Ray was loading a delivery truck at the prison bakery when he managed to hide in the back of the truck and slip out through those prison gates and made his way to Canada as a fugitive on the run. Ray never stayed in a place for very long, and once the heat cooled down a bit, he was back in America, moving from city to city in a Mustang he had bought in Alabama, where he soon made his way west and then crossed the southern border into Mexico. He continued to crisscross America, evading authorities from California to Georgia for all of 1967 and early into 1968. Now, 1968 was a turbulent time in America. The Vietnam War was raging in the Tet Offensive, and many people were protesting the increasingly unpopular war. At the same time, America was at war internally, and the civil rights movement was at its height, where they were seeking equality and an end to the Jim Crow laws for Black Americans. No other man was more influential in this movement than a Southern preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Dr. King had led Montgomery boycotts during 1965, and he would lead many crusades across America that led to the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 and increased labor rights for minorities. Perhaps he was most famous for his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, which led to a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Dr. King was a proponent of nonviolent protest, yet wherever his protests went, violence just seemed to follow. In 1958, King survived a knife attack and later a bomb attack on his own home. And by 1968, King found himself advocating on behalf of Black sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was staying in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel. Now, Dr. King had actually stayed in this particular room on many occasions, and it was well known by his admirers and enemies alike. On the evening of Thursday, April 4th, King was exiting his second-story room. Unbeknownst to him, an assassin was hidden across the street, aiming his .30-06 rifle at him, where he shot the civil rights advocate dead. The shooting sparked national outrage and riots in major cities all across America as the FBI searched for King's killer. Investigators found that rifle with fingerprints leading to none other than the prison fugitive James Earl Ray. Overnight, Ray became the most wanted man in the world. And for more than 2 months, Ray evaded authorities by fleeing to Canada, Portugal, and then London before being captured trying to flee to Brussels, Belgium. On June 8, 1968, Ray was extradited back to Tennessee to face those murder charges, where, acting on the advice of his lawyer, James Earl Ray confessed to killing Dr. King. However, controversy broke out just 3 days later when he recanted that confession. For his crimes, James Earl Ray was sentenced to 99 years at Brushy Mountain Maximum Security Prison. But just how long could Brushy Mountain's walls contain the world's most wanted man? On June 10, 1977, James Earl Ray and 6 other men, including 3 convicted killers, managed to escape over this wall behind me next to the guard tower. A perfectly timed prison fight distracted the guards just long enough for James Earl Ray and his men to begin pulling out scraps of metal that they put together and miraculously made a 12-foot ladder, leaned it up against this fence, and then managed to escape underneath the electric wires and barbed wire at the top into these mountains. Soon, a massive manhunt, including U.S. Marshals, the FBI, and bloodhounds, were scouring the unforgiving mountains that surrounded this prison in the biggest manhunt in Appalachian history. That's right. Ray made a daring escape that once again resulted in a manhunt for the ages. This brief escape would be Ray's last taste of freedom, and after 3 days of running, he was methodically tracked down by bloodhounds and promptly returned to Brushy Mountain. A few years later, prison inmates attacked James Earl, stabbing him 22 times and nearly killing him. Yet, Ray survived. As notorious as James Earl Ray was, he was just your typical run-of-the-mill criminal at Brushy Mountain. That's right, there were men far more dangerous, and perhaps none were more feared than Paul Dennis Reed. Brushy Mountain was home to the most violent breed of men, even serial killers. But perhaps no one was more notorious than Paul Dennis Reed, known as the fast food killer. The Nashville music scene was on top of the world in 1997, with artists like George Strait, Alan Jackson, and Tim McGraw topping the charts. Thousands of aspiring artists from all over the United States flocked to the music city with dreams of making it big. One such up-and-comer was Justin Parks, a singer-songwriter who had recently moved to the country capital with dreams of stardom. Hailing from Fort Worth, Texas, with a mysterious past, Reed immediately distributed press kits to producers and record companies to announce his arrival. His biography listed him as a clean-cut, well-dressed, 6'3" stud with a booming voice that could melt all the ladies' hearts with its 2.5-octave range. Parks rented out a small studio apartment, and like most struggling musicians, he worked various side jobs during the day, while playing clubs up and down Broadway at night. However, the road to becoming a professional country music singer is littered with countless shattered dreams and broken hearts. And despite his best efforts, Parks hadn't been able to break through. And even worse, money was scarce. In fact, the singer's car had recently been repossessed due to falling behind on payments. And now he was walking. Because of this, on February 16th, 1997, the country cowboy decided to apply for a job at a local Captain D's restaurant in a well-to-do area of Nashville. When he arrived for the interview, the parking lot was empty, and once inside, he noticed that there weren't any customers. And as he approached the counter, he noticed that there were only 2 employees, a 25-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl. Now I need to pause here for just a moment. You see, I've featured many notorious outlaws on Appalachia's Deadliest, and I always try to imagine just what goes through a criminal's mind. But for Justin Parks, well, he was the ultimate Jekyll and Hyde split personality. It turns out that this wannabe country singer actually had a violent past that he had left behind in Texas. And unbeknownst to the 2 employees at that Captain D's, Justin Parks was actually a man named Paul Dennis Reed, who had been convicted of 7 armed robberies back in Texas and had even been involved in 2 shootouts during those robberies. This mysterious singer was actually a serial killer. Back in the present, the manager approached Reed to begin the interview, but Reed, he had no time for filling out an application. Instead, he pulled a pistol and marched both employees into the cooler, forcing them to lay face down on the floor, and without any mercy, he shot both of them execution style, before emptying the cash register and disappearing from the crime scene. However, as horrific as this crime was, Paul Dennis Reed was just getting started. The senseless killings rocked the Nashville area, and police had no clues. Rewards were offered for any and all information, but none came forth. And privately, detectives feared that anyone capable of this type of violence was sure to strike again. March 23rd, 1997. Just 4 weeks later, Paul Dennis Reed struck again, this time at a McDonald's that was located just 2 miles away from his first crime. Using a car that he had purchased with the money from his first crime, Reed made his move as 4 night shift employees exited the building after closing. Pulling his Colt pistol, Reed forced them back inside and locked the door. The workers were then marched into the kitchen, where Reed made all 4 terrified employees face the wall when he opened fire, shooting 3 of them execution style. The 4th employee realized that he had to act immediately to save his life, so In desperation, he charged at Reed, who once again squeezed the trigger, but the bullet missed the moving target. Suddenly, the two men were grappling and struggling for the upper hand when Reed managed to pull out a pocket knife and stabbed the employee 17 times before leaving him for dead. The killer then coolly emptied the cash register and exited the restaurant. Back inside the kitchen, 3 people had lost their lives, but the 4th had somehow survived the knife attack and managed to crawl to a phone and dial 911 before passing out. All of Nashville was gripped in terror. It was clear a serial killer was on the loose. Restaurants began closing, and many employees refused to even report to work. Police now had a description of the killer, and they were frantically searching for him. But would they be able to find him before he struck again? April 23, 1997. Exactly 1 month later, Paul Dennis Reed reemerged, this time at a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. 2 female employees were closing up the restaurant when they heard Reed knocking at the door, asking them to please just make one more quick sale before they closed. And so, the women unlocked the door and let the wanted killer inside, where once again, he emptied the cash register, and this time, he took both women hostage, taking them to a nearby park where both women were found murdered the next day. However, unbeknownst to Reed, as he pulled out of the parking lot with the female employees, another customer who was eating his ice cream in the parking lot became suspicious and wrote down Reed's license plate number. 2 days later, police arrested Paul Dennis Reed and charged him with 7 counts of first-degree murder. It was then that police departments all across America began to reach out to Nashville investigators and stated that they believed Paul Dennis Reed had committed similar crimes in their states. And to this day, no one really knows exactly how many lives this monster took. He would be convicted and became the first and only person in the history of Tennessee to receive 7 death sentences for his crimes and would spend the rest of his life locked away in Brushy Mountain prison. Coming up, no one was above the law at Brushy Mountain, not even dirty politicians. And as you already know, politicians are some of the biggest criminals, and they too were no stranger to the Brushy Mountain prison. Brian Looper was one such man who was addicted to the intoxicating allure of political power, and he would stop at nothing to win an election, even murdering his political opponent. Growing up, Byron Looper was your typical middle-class teenager. His father had served in the Army and worked in the education field his entire career, serving as a principal and later a superintendent of schools in Barrow County, Georgia, and Putnam County, Tennessee. It was only natural that the importance of a good education was instilled in Byron, and after graduating high school, he promptly entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was a type of place where an up-and-coming young man could make powerful political connections, which Byron did, rubbing elbows with powerful politicians and even serving as an aide in the Georgia House of Representatives. The lifestyle of wealthy politicians was intoxicating to Looper, so much so that he would eventually earn a political science degree and a master's in business administration. At just 24 years old, he was ready to spread his wings as a public servant and decided to run as a Democratic candidate in the Georgia State House of Representatives race. However, the voters weren't impressed with young Looper, and he finished last place. Georgia politics proved to be a tough nut that Looper couldn't crack. Perhaps what the would-be politician needed was a change of venue and philosophy. Yeah, that should do the trick. With that in mind, Looper moved to East Tennessee and once again threw his hat in the race for the Tennessee House of Representatives, this time as a Republican. Yet once again, Looper lost the race. It just didn't make any sense. After all, he had done all the right things, participating in public debates and appearances, shaking hands, smiling that fake plastic smile, and kissing babies. Then, in 1996, Looper had an epiphany. Perhaps he needed a new name. That's right, showing no shame at all. Byron Looper legally changed his name to Byron Low Tax Looper, complete with the parentheses and all. And once again he ran for public office, this time as a property assessor in Putnam County, Tennessee. And this time, he didn't even bother to participate in any debates. He didn't make any appearances, nothing. He just put his name on the ballot, Byron Low Tax Looper. And just like that, the voters elected him. Byron had done it. He had a big fancy office down at the courthouse where he sat at his desk in his big leather chair, all the while wearing the finest double-breasted business suits. However, it turns out that being a tax assessor wasn't all Byron had hoped it would be. So the only time he bothered to show up for work was to collect his paycheck. Other than that, he never reported to work at all. And by 1998, there were lawsuits alleging fraud and improper use of government funds. So Looper decided to do what any crooked politician would do. It was time to run for a higher office. This time for a seat in the Tennessee Senate. Yet his opponent was a Democratic senator named Tommy Burks, a 28-year veteran and powerful politician who was deeply entrenched in the office. All the editorial writers and political columnists laughed at Low Tax Looper. He would get destroyed in a general election. In their mind, he had exactly zero chance to defeat Burks. But what all those naysayers failed to realize was just how far Looper was willing to go to get into that office. That's right, and Byron was a firm believer in the old saying, if you can't beat 'em, kill 'em. Proving that he was indeed an astute student of the law, Looper discovered an obscure clause in the Tennessee law regarding election rules. If a candidate were to die less than 30 days from the general election, by law, that candidate's name must be removed from all ballots. And moreover, the political party that he represented couldn't replace the candidate's name with a new one. On the morning of October 19th, 1997, just 24 days before the election, Byron rode out to the rural farm owned by Tommy Burks and found the state senator casually sitting in his work truck, chatting with one of his farm hands. Back and forth, over and over, Byron rode in his black car right in front of the farm, waiting for the worker to finish his conversation. And when the moment was right, Byron slipped up to Senator Burks' truck door, pulled out a 9mm, and shot the senator dead. The crime sent shockwaves across Tennessee. Senator Burks had no known enemies, and there were no clues at the crime scene. They literally didn't know who committed the deed. Meanwhile, newspapers began to report that Burks' name would indeed be removed from the official ballots, leaving only one name for voters to choose from, and that was Low Tax Looper. However, a few days after the crime, the farmhand who was the last to see Burks alive was watching the news about the election when they showed Looper's face on TV. Instantly, he recognized that man as the same person who had been driving the black car back and forth in front of the farm in the moments before the crime. Byron Looper had conveniently disappeared in the days after the crime, but when he snuck back home in the middle of the night on the 6th day, police were waiting for him and promptly arrested him for first-degree murder. At the trial, a good friend of Low Tax Looper took the stand, where he testified that Looper had confessed to the crime and even asked for advice on how to get rid of his car. So it took the jury little time to render a verdict of guilty. 2 hours later, the judge sentenced Looper to life in Brushy Mountain prison with no possibility of parole. Regarding the election, even as a convicted killer, 5% of all voters still voted for low-tax Looper as state senator. The remaining voters simply wrote in the state senator's wife's name, and she was elected. Low Tax would find life behind bars at Brushy Mountain to be more than he could take. He was arrogant and spent most of his time there in trouble. Then, one day in 2013, Looper pushed a pregnant prison counselor, and those guards, they put a beating on him for the ages. 2 hours later, Byron Low Tax Looper was found dead in his cell. Indeed, Brushy Mountain Prison was a rough place to be. And I'd like to leave you with this one final thought. Because of its lawless history and the hundreds of men that met their demise at the prison, to this day, many people claim that that place is haunted. Now, I don't want to claim to be an expert on such things, but I wanted to share an experience that I had there while I was filming this episode. You see, at one point, I found myself in a room on the lowest level of the prison. I was completely alone, and the room was completely silent, with the only sounds being my footsteps. Yet, for some reason, something made me curious about the room. I didn't have my good camera, so I took out my iPhone and I took a quick video with it. Well, as I was editing this video this week, I took a look at that iPhone video, and I couldn't believe what the audio sounded like. Take a listen for yourself and let me know what you think it is in the comments below. Till next time, my friends, be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.